Is everyone really neurodivergent these days? Hello to all the neuro-wild and neuro-wonderful of you. I'm Lisa and I'm neurodivergent, parent of 2 neurodivergent children and married to a neurodivergent as well. I started this channel to provide community, support, advice and information to people in similar situations as myself. It's so important to have other people to share experiences with and to be able to recognise a little bit of yourself in. So even though I struggled with RSD, if you know, you know, in posting this video, I decided that I would do so in the hopes that it might help some other people to recognise something in themselves, in their children as well. So, the topic of today's video is everybody really neurodivergent? And I think we've all seen the news articles kind of claiming, oh, massive increase in rates of autism or ADHD, and everybody's neurodivergent now. Is this really true? Personally, I don't think so. I suspect that the actual rates of neurodivergence in the human population have remained pretty stable over time. For a number of different reasons, but largely due to the way that evolution works. It makes sense in a population to have a majority as the norm, and then to have a significant minority with various differences to allow for those differences to function within the environment, to see whether they actually provide benefits. Before I go any further, I think it's a good idea to clarify what I mean by these terms. So neurotypical refers to, of course, people with standard operating brains. You can think of people basically like computers, and if you're neurotypical, you'd be running a pretty standard operating system like Windows, for example. This means that neurotypical people can communicate pretty easily with each other. They all tend to work on roughly the same sort of assumptions. They can share information easily. It's all in the same sort of format. Neurodivergent people, on the other hand, have a whole variety of different divergences or differences, which makes it a lot more difficult for neurodivergent people to communicate, sometimes with each other, as well as, of course, with neurotypical people. Now, this isn't to say that neurotypical people are like boring and, standard or normal, whatever normal is. But obviously, everybody is different, everybody is unique. The difference is that with neurodivergent people, our differences relate to how we acquire information, how we process that information, and how we communicate it. So, if neurotypical people are running Windows, for example, then neurodivergent people could be running anything from, Mac OS to Linux to Raspberry Pi to, I don't know, I've run out of operating systems, but a whole host of others. So there's a whole wide range of different ways in which you can be neurodivergent as well. Now, neurodiversity is, of course, the big term of the moment. And honestly, I don't really think this applies to a person. I don't think you can say somebody is neurodiverse. I think neurodiversity, neurodiverse as an adjective, is best applied to situations or populations, shall we say. So humanity as a whole is neurodiverse. There's no getting around that. We have neurotypical people, we have neurodivergent people. And that means, as a whole, our population is neurodiverse. Any situation or environment in which there is a mixture, like school or work, if you've got a combination of neurotypical people and neurodivergent people, you can say that that situation is neurodiverse. Neurodiversity can also be a nice way of expressing inclusion or acceptance of all of our differences. and the awareness that people come with maybe neurotypical brains or neurodivergent brains, and accepting and including everybody within that sphere. Is the prevalence of neurodiversity really increasing? Well, I don't think so. I think the number of people with neurodivergent brains has remained fairly stable in the human population. I think what's led to our perception that the number of neurodivergent people has increased is largely down to an increase in diagnosis of neurodivergent conditions. And the diagnosis of neurodivergent conditions is a different thing from the existence of neurodivergent conditions. The increase in diagnosis is down to a couple of different things. One, better diagnosis, better diagnostic criteria. So over time, of course, we gather evidence, we gather data. That data, as we sift through it, as we look at it, as we examine it, helps to inform our understanding of different conditions, and so helps to refine our diagnostic criteria for those conditions. So refined or more precise diagnostic criteria, and then also expanded diagnostic criteria. For example, in the past, many of the conditions that we see an increase in today, such as autism and ADHD particularly, would only have been diagnosed in children. They were seen as children's disorders at the time. And so adults could not be diagnosed with these conditions. And in fact, once a child who had been diagnosed with one of these conditions reached adulthood, they were no longer seen as having that condition, which of course nowadays we know is not the case. These conditions are lifelong conditions. They are a way in which we process the world. That's not something you grow out of. The way in which these conditions present themselves can change over time as we develop different coping mechanisms, as we learn to mask, and as we just grow older. So the expansion of these diagnoses to include, for example, adults, different genders other than male, has obviously increased the number of diagnoses. And another thing that I think is quite important here is also the number of people who are, because largely, particularly for adults of course, diagnosis is self-led for many of these conditions. And so an awareness, an understanding of these conditions has actually improved over the years, so that nowadays many people who before wouldn't have even considered getting a diagnosis or even being assessed for these conditions are now starting to recognise many of the symptoms, the diagnostic criteria in themselves, in their own behaviour, whereas previously they just wouldn't have even registered. And so that increased awareness, that increased availability of information has meant that there are more people, particularly adults, putting themselves forward for assessment, for diagnosis. And so does it really matter if there's an increase in the number of diagnoses of these different neurodivergent conditions? The increased diagnosis of people with these neurodivergent conditions doesn't, of course, mean that there's an increased number of people with these conditions. It just means that there's an increased number of people who are now aware of what the condition is that they have, and aware that they can actually ask for accommodations, that they have a right to be able to access society and to be able to ask for those accessibility arrangements. And often those accessibility arrangements or accommodations that are meant to benefit neurodivergent people are often really helpful for neurotypical people too. So think about, for example, lower sensory load. Many neurotypical people also benefit from being able to go shopping at quiet hours. If these things are made widely available, if these accommodations are accepted as part of the standard, as part of the norm of operating, then it means that society as a whole becomes more accessible for all of us, not just for neurodivergent people. So in that case, it shouldn't really be an issue of scarcity of resources. It's more of an issue of awareness and the provisions of these different accessibility arrangements and accommodations which can benefit everybody. Not forgetting, of course, that neurotypical people can often find themselves becoming neurodivergent later in life. There are a number of different conditions that can be developed later in life, or possibly even just situationally needing accommodations. Essentially, yes, there have been an increase in numbers of people being diagnosed with autism and ADHD over the past few years, say a couple of decades. However, I don't think that this indicates rising rates of ADHD or autism. I believe that this simply indicates a better awareness among medical professionals in terms of the diagnostic criteria used and how those are applied, and also more awareness and understanding among people ourselves to be able to even consider that this might be something that would apply to us. That's it from me for today. If you liked this, or if you found it at all interesting or informative, please do like and subscribe. And if you would like to see more similar content, please do let me know in a comment below what kinds of topics you would like to see me cover in the future. I hope to be posting every week with new content related to being neurodivergent and parenting neurodivergent children. So do let me know if there's anything that you'd like me to talk about. Hope to see you again soon.